Let's talk about books. This is June part 2, and these are the ones that I already covered. I'm going to talk about these 4 books. So let's get started. We can start with the top. Making decisions into big decisions that don't need to be. This is Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. It was my first Sally Rooney book, which is a little bit crazy, but we must remember I did not get into fiction right away when I got back into reading as an adult. It was only, well, my dad and I always say when you estimate time, you have to add 3 years. So let's say it was only 5 years ago that I got into reading fiction, because in my head I'm like, 2 or 3. So, yeah. When I started at the bookstore, I was really intent on reading one of each of kind of the biggest authors' books so that I was conversant on the most important ones. So like Amor Towles, I read A Gentleman in Moscow. There was a fair number like that. Bel Canto, My First Anne Patchett. As we now know, I've since done a ton more of that. But anyway, I had not read Sally Rooney. So I thought, start at the beginning. Conversations with Friends. This is a novel set in Dublin in like now. And it follows Frances, who is she 19 or 21? She's at school. She has a best friend named Bobby, and Bobby is also female, and they do slam poetry together, which sounds cringe, but it's not in the way that she does it. And they used to date, but now they're just best friends. And Frances experiences herself as very cold and emotionless. And it's really what Rooney does with that from there is really cool. I think that that's a really hard needle to thread of a main character who kind of thinks that she's not just unlovable, but like almost boring, or at least like emotionless, like incapable of care in a way that she thinks other people are, and to watch her understanding of herself transform throughout the book. So I'm gonna do spoilers because this has been out for so long, almost 10 years, and it's been a Netflix show with Joe Alwyn and one of the girls from Girls, which I have the Lena Dunham book here. So that was a wild crossover of the reading month. Neither of which are shows I have seen, both of which I have watched like a trailer for on YouTube since reading this book, which is about my level of film watching in my life. So, Frances and Bobby are best friends. They meet Melissa, who's married to Nick, at some party, and they go over to the house for dinner. And then it's like, ooh, what's happening? Because Bobby's flirting with Melissa, and Frances is like looking at Nick, basically. Nothing really happens that first night. And from there, I keep looking at the phone. It looks so crooked. Okay, I think that looks fine. Uh-oh, what if you hear how nicely loud my volume is when I'm that close to the phone? And are devastated by, now I'm gonna talk louder. But the microphone thing did not work. That was not worth it back in the day. In the early videos. Go back if you haven't ever seen them. You're missing out. Okay, the phone is not crooked. Messy, and then messier, and then somehow, even though it's messy, it's very cozy, and not very cozy, but it stays almost comfortable in a way that's really impressive. The interiority of Frances, who you're with the whole time, is super interesting. If you need massive shift in circumstance to feel like your characters transform, if you need retribution, if you feel like massive things need to happen in a book that never promises that massive things are going to happen, then this is not the book for you. The transformation is quiet and it is almost slow. And so if you find Frances unlikable and not in a way that's fun, then this is going to be a really tough read. It's short, so you'll probably still finish it, but I think that that's good to know. I phrased all of that in the negative, which I almost wish I would have flipped and been like, I kind of did it a little bit earlier, but like, it is to me so impressive what this book does and how it does it. And that is why, as a debut, it still really took off. I said one thing in my review in the back. It was full of smooth, strong writing. I love when every word is in its place and every page is in the right place in the scene, and there's only exactly as many scenes in the book as you need to make happen what needs to happen. That's like the whole thing with fiction. That's the point. This book did not get that, and so I loved that. Frances is lonely, but because she sees herself as cold and emotionless, she, for much of the novel, is unable to identify, express, or do anything to alleviate her loneliness. But the thing is, like, when that's true about you, like, you're still alive. You're still living and interacting with other people and going to school or going on dates or whatever. And Rooney made that not just interesting, but, well, she made it interesting and compelling. Her attempts to alleviate her loneliness are bumpy. She creates physical intimacy with Nick, but eschews emotional intimacy in favor of cold repartee and a distance she doesn't even want. Frances, girl, she hides things from Bobby, her best friend, multiple times over the course of the book, and usually the problem, as with like lying to people you love, is not the content, but the fact that she lied or omitted. Then watches the consequences of her silence and then her secrets being discovered with half surprise and half resignation. She slowly learns to say what she thinks, and you really watch it happen over the course of the novel, to think better about her relationships, to actually apologize. There's also emails throughout this book that are so well written. To switch from writing excellent prose into internet jargon and run-on sentences because your characters are emailing at midnight or whatever, Rooney did a really good job at that. And there's one like mean email that's like 3 pages long that was so good at like yelling, and that was great. Okay, and then huge addition, huge news in addition to this book and almost no other fiction, as we talked about in my Where Are All the Periods Substack article, that fiction and movies and almost all media have no periods in them that are not what I call male adjacent. So like, am I pregnant? And the ones that do, usually it's like a first period, which is important and also not the same thing as what women experience every single month throughout their whole life, which is also would be a really strong plot device. Because anyway, read the thing. Writers and Lovers had that in it, a non-pregnancy related period situation, and this one did too. And then, do I want to spoil? Not really, but yes, because we said we're doing spoilers. Okay, so first of all, she just gets really bad period cramps one day and she has to take pain pills, and then the next scene, then she's having really bad pain and she has to, like, I think she faints, so she has to go to the hospital, or she makes a doctor's appointment, and she thinks she's pregnant. Then I was like, oh shoot, of course. No, she wasn't pregnant. And then she has to go back for an ultrasound. And then it turns out she has endometriosis. And so this is also a book with endo in it, which is great and rare, and talks about the difficulty of getting it. Actually, I don't know that I would say it talks about the difficulty of getting it diagnosed. A little bit, because she doesn't realize that her period pain is worse than everybody else's, which is really common for women with endometriosis. They think other people are just like better at handling pain. But also this is NHS, National Health Services in the UK. Actually, no, it's not, because this is in Dublin. Okay, well, anyway, she doesn't take 10 years to get a diagnosis, which is what you have to do if you live in America. Not if you have to. It's the average length of time. So that was phenomenal, amazing, perfect, no notes, very exciting. I'm actually surprised that when I polled all of my friends to try and think of books with periods in them, that this one didn't come up. But I don't think that's really how we remember fiction, especially a book with this that's not super plot heavy. So anyway, man, I thought this was going to be the short one. I thought it was going to be the short one that I talked about for not very long. Well, let's do Dominion next. Stick with fiction. This is Dominion by Addie E. Kitchens, forgive me. I think this cover is so good. This is a novel set in Mississippi at a megachurch, at a very large black church in a town in Mississippi. And it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize. So I read it like 2 days before the Women's Prize was announced. And then I think I gave this 4 stars. It didn't floor me. And I also didn't think Heart the Lover should win. And I didn't think, well, I didn't love The Correspondent. So, I'm sorry, that was really all over the place. There were 5 or 6 shortlisted titles. Those 3 I just listed, and The Mercy Step and Kingfisher. And I was pulling for The Mercy Step, which I had not read, and I don't think you can even get in the US yet, because it sounded the most like the one that I would want, and I didn't want any of the other 3 with my whole heart. Then Virginia Evans won for The Correspondent, and like I teared up watching her speech, and she's so sweet, so that was totally fine. Anyway, this one got a neutral review by Ash on Book Fair, and like neutral warm, or maybe it was Kat who read it, I don't remember, but that was about right. The structure of the book was really interesting. There were a lot of strong points throughout. Then the ending did not land quite as hard and well as it needed to, especially for all of the things that it had been trying to do. Now, there's 2 female main characters that we follow, and one of them goes out kind of quietly, and it works. I actually think that was really clever. But the other one didn't. Okay, let's not be so vague. So sorry. We have a family. Like this matters. The Winfreys. So there's the dad, who goes by Rev, as in Reverend, his wife, who is one of our main characters, Priscilla. And then Rev and Priscilla have some kids, and some of them are like in college or, you know, off being successful. The youngest one, Wonder Boy is his nickname. His name is something, and Emmanuel, he goes by Manny, and he goes by Wonder Boy, lots of nicknames. He is a junior or senior in high school. So they are super wealthy. He is dating a girl named Diamond, and Diamond is the other main character that you follow. And the way this is structured is churchy piece of paper. So like a pamphlet, a history thing. You're reading it as if you picked it up at the Seven Seals Church. Then a bit of just third person narration. So-and-so goes here, does this is where they are, and this is what happens. Then you get a really iffy, kind of scary story of, you're like, this is a bad vibe, but you don't quite know who's doing the badness. It's just one little page. It has a weird number at the top. Then you get Priscilla, the mother, and Diamond, the girlfriend. One of them narrates, and then the other one narrates in first person. If that sounds confusing, it actually is not when you're reading it. It's cool because the men in this story behave badly. Hence the little summaries of non-consensual relationship moments that are like 1 page long, and many other things going on. Because they love the men in their lives, they turn a blind eye often to what is going on. Because of that, it's actually really useful to have these third person objective narrations before you get to the part where Diamond or Priscilla is speaking, because you're like, oh, you have this outsider perspective, so you know what's actually true and what they're pretending is true. You sometimes know more than they do. And yeah, there were a lot of pretty cool moments. I'm not gonna go any more in detail. But there were some really strong scenes, and then the end, as I said, was not strong. Okay. If you like a novel that does something a little bit cool with the structure, but isn't hard to read, then this would be a good one. If you like things set in the South, or examinations of problematic institutionalized religion, or power that doesn't get questioned very well, or if anything else that I said about it sounds interesting to you, then you should read it. I think I gave it 3.5-ish stars, and it was a quick read. The next book is Famesick by Lena Dunham. This is a memoir. It just came out. It outsold Patrick Radden Keefe like week 1 or week 2, which kind of surprised me. He wrote Say Nothing. That's too far away, but I always pull it out, so you probably know what it's like. I had no plans to read this book. Then I received a copy of it. Then I walked it from wherever I was in my home to the giveaway take out to free library book pile. And then I would just look up 5 minutes later, and I would be standing still in the middle of the room, unable to put the book down. And then I thought, so I just set it down. It happened like 3 more times where I just wasn't trying to read it, and then I would open it to a random page because you can't spoil a book you're not planning to read, and then I would be sad. And I'd heard from Roxane Gay in her review, she was like, Lena Dunham is a great writer, and that carries a lot of weight for me. I saw after I read it that in that review, Roxane Gay also said that she thought it was a little too long in places, which I didn't. So that's cool. That's interesting to me because I always think things are too long. I think that Roxane Gay absolutely has a point, and I would love to watch her, like to hear her describe what she would cut and stuff, because this is, I think, 388 pages or something pretty long. What do you need to know about this? I think not much, because you'll know if you think you want to read it or if you don't. I can't remember if I've said this or not, but Lena Dunham shared the last article that I wrote that I had published at the end of May. And so that also probably made me more inclined to give it a read. And then it was lovely to read the story of someone else who has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and just to see like it in all its different iterations, because it is such an individual disease. So her writing about, her writing about pain in hospitals was great, which it was. And like we kind of talked about the Argonauts, that's pretty hard to do. I think it's really hard to describe being sick, especially in first person about yourself, in a way that, like, sickness is kind of the most like ordinary and undescribable thing. was it Susan Sontag who was like, I don't know why illness isn't up there with like war, love, and death as like, war, love, and something else as the greatest themes of Western literature. There's some quote like that. And yeah, another thing Dunham does that's really interesting is she compares celebrity and fame to illness and draws some interesting parallels between those. And I thought the book was really, really strong in how it centered everything on her and her growth and her reflections, which is what a memoir ought to do. Is when you are famous and you're talking about other famous people, I am especially interested in seeing a level of finesse like this. I never thought actually there was one brief thing about Barbara Walters that was my most interested name drop of the book. But most of the stories, especially about the men, which would be Adam Driver, who played her boyfriend on Girls, and Jack Antonoff, who was her boyfriend for like 7 years, plus other famous people mentioned, none of them felt gratuitous, selfish, as in like, I want to tell you this just because it makes this person look bad, or unattached. They were all very tied into what she was trying to say about how she felt or what she learned in a specific moment. And with that, I thought that she did a pretty good job, especially describing her side of a really public breakup with a really famous man that a lot of people like. I didn't have the feeling after this book that I've seen other people say, which is like, now I have so many more reasons to hate Jack Antonoff. I think that sometimes people shouldn't be dating each other, and so then they're not dating each other, and that's fine. And also, not my business. I don't care about the breakup. Like, I care about the story that she's trying to tell me. And so that was a strength. It reminded me of Between Two Kingdoms, because in this book, she describes at length her ex, because he cares for her through a lot of her first cancer diagnosis, but she ends up with John Batiste, and the breakup is a little bit messy. And I thought he came off, the first ex, came off like kind of a hero, honestly, in that book. And I think that's a really important part of memoir to nail. I think it can be really hard. Another example of that tone would be Know My Name. Like, Chanel Miller describes going back through over and over and taking out anything that was like a little bit too angry or not perfectly calibrated to what she was trying to say. And so props to that. The final thing I was going to say that I really appreciated is she doesn't portray marriage as the fix. Finding a man who really loves her and does not mind her illness. Her husband, who she's still married to, is only on a very few number of pages at the end of this book and is not presented as a solution to anything. And I loved that, and I thought it really worked. It was the opposite for me of Group, which is a book largely about Christy Tate's difficulty with relationships. So in the end, she does get married, and that's where the book ends. She has this line that's like, I don't want you to think that like this is a happy ending because of my marriage. But like, girl, that's how you structure the book. Like, regardless of what you say you want, that's kind of what you're telling us. One that did it slightly, I would say, between those two, but better than Group, is What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. In this one, she suffers from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and her relationship with her boyfriend is a pretty important part of her story because it's one of the first times she's in a relationship that is healthy, and she's trying to learn how to be healthy in a relationship, and they get married. So she tells that story in here. And then at the end of the wedding chapter, she says, this would be a nice place to wrap things up. A happy ending, after all, contained within the best day of my life. But in the end, it was not simply love that helped me come to terms once and for all with my CPTSD. It was tragedy. And there's a whole nother chapter or two, and she has a whole setup where it's like the COVID pandemic happened, and she said when you have CPTSD, you're always preparing for a crisis. So the thing is that when there's a real crisis, you're like totally set, because that's like, you always feel that way. And so she talks about how she handled the crisis of living in New York City during a pandemic where millions of people around you are dying. And I thought that was a really strong, like, structural decision. It's hard to have like a cliffhanger chapter ending in a memoir. Anyway, this one was an even more subtle version of the like, I'm married, but that's not the reason that I'm safe or not addicted to pills or whatever it is anymore. And the final thing to take away from this book is that even when you're incredibly wealthy, the healthcare system is really, really hard to be a woman in, and it's really not set up for chronic illness. And there's a story in here that will haunt me forever. That's dramatic. There's a story in here.
Orlando, another doctor, not her doctor, to say that she's actually ill.
What's that? I love that I was just like, this haunted me. And I was like, actually, no, but let me explain it to you. Is that too violent? I mean, it happened. I wouldn't say haunted me, but there's a specific story of a really bad medical situation because of a doctor's incompetence and unwillingness to believe in her pain that is really tragic and hard and sad. What do you say? What do you say we pause there? I want to pause there because I don't think I think these can go together. How wild. Thank you for watching Dune Part 2. It's like Dune Part 2, but with less sand and no worms. I will see you guys like in 5 minutes, because I'm just going to turn the AC on for a minute and then cool down and then talk about the DNFs of the month, of which there were giant ones, either giant books or arcs. And then I'm also going to talk about this precious baby. Okay, bye.